right, good afternoon, everybody. We're just waiting. I guess we have most everybody here. So let me introduce you to Professor Todd Henry. He is Professor Korean history. He wrote a book on covering the colonial period and is a professor at UC San Diego currently, but is in Korea for, is it sabbatical?
I'm teaching at Underwood College at Yonsei.
Okay, so teaching. But his specialization is this particular topic that we're looking at today. So I thought that it would be a nice treat for all of you to have an expert come in and talk. So Professor Henry, I will hand it off to you.
Okay. Can everybody see the screen? You see the marriage, couple getting married? Okay. Yeah, so as Professor Yu mentioned, I originally began my research on the colonial period, but I'm currently studying the post-colonial, post-liberation period of South Korea. So mostly the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I'm very interested in trying to study the history of what's today called sexual minorities, 성소수자. Although at that time, of course, there was no such word. As you may know, that's a word that emerged in the 1990s as Korea became a democratic society and when a variety of social movements emerged to try to advocate for the human rights of a variety of minority groups. But that doesn't mean that people who were attracted to the same sex or people who engaged in non-normative gender presentations didn't exist within Korean history. I first came to Korea, actually I was a Korean language student at Kodae in 1998. And I used to hear when I came to Korea that there were no gay people in Korea. That was a quite common sort of myth, urban myth. And at first I was quite surprised by that because I knew gay people. I myself am a gay man. And I had been involved in student activism at SNU. And so I both thought that was a bit ridiculous, but I tried to understand why that was the case. So as I work with activist groups, I realized that much of their effort was focused in the present to try to create new kinds of laws and to create human rights protections, to take discriminatory language out of publications, to overturn, for example, the military law that still exists in South Korea today, Law 92-6, which criminalizes same-sex behavior in the military. So there's a lot of issues that activists were beginning to work on in the late 90s. When I first came to Korea, many of them they're still working on. Also related to the legalization of sex reassignment and changing one's name, changing one's legal sex. That was all happening beginning in the late 1990s into the first 2 decades of the 21st century, excuse me. Like Professor Yu, I was trained in history. So while I was interested and participated in the movements, I also wanted to have a better sense of what happened before the 1990s. Partly because, as I mentioned, the activists themselves were too busy and didn't have the resources to necessarily study what came before that era. And also because I was very curious about why, again, many Koreans told me, went out of their way to tell me that there were no gay people in Korea. Because when I started to look at historical materials, which is what we're trained to do, to go look at newspapers and magazines, I found a lot of evidence that same-sex sexuality and what we would call today transgender or gender nonconforming people certainly existed within Korean history and were an important, if difficult to look at, topic of debate. In fact, the kinds of images like you see here on the screen, this is actually two women who held a semi-public wedding ceremony in 1985. These kinds of things you could find quite a lot in the materials, starting from the period after the end of the Korean War, all the way up until the period of South Korea's democratization. So that's kind of what I'm interested in working on these days, and particularly in the context of Korea's current rapid demographic changes. That is to say, as you all know, you probably come, if you're Korean, you probably come from families that have on average 1 or 2 children. People are, especially women, are delaying marriage. They're not getting married. I'm sure you are all familiar with the Pihon movement, people who just, particularly women, say they don't want to be a part of families or don't want to be placed into an institution that limits their freedom or that restricts their ability to succeed and be the people that they want to in Korean society. So as you probably know, issues around sexual minorities today are talked about with a lot of intensity, but I think that there's still a piece of history missing that I'm trying to fill in my own research as debates, for example, around the possibility that South Korea, like the United States, like Taiwan, like various places in Europe, in Latin America, even one country in Africa, could someday soon legalize same-sex marriage. And so I will give you a little bit of the history. I called the presentation Weddings Without Marriage because even the weddings ceremonies that I will show you, these were never legalized or formalized. That is, they were never recognized by the state, but nonetheless, particularly women, the cases are mostly about women. They demonstrate that some women went out of their way to create alternative relationships with other women, avoiding, we could call patriarchy, the domination of men, and avoiding the institution of heterosexual marriage by informally partnering with other women. So I want to show you a bit about that history today to try to explore that same-sex intimacy and same-sex partnerships are not new to Korea. They didn't begin in the 1990s. And they also, in my view, were not imported from overseas. It's not some, American phenomena that came to Korea from overseas and should be seen as something foreign. It's actually quite indigenous and local to the situation, particularly of women in the post-war period, for whom a relationship was often a necessity in order to survive, but that relationship could possibly exist with other women. So I want to show you this image, which I like to begin the presentation with. And these are 2 images, one from fairly recently, although it's already 7 years old, but if you might remember back to 2013, if you're all college students, 7 years ago, you were like maybe 10 or 15. Does anybody remember? This is Kim Jo-Kwang-soo. He is famous gay activist and film director. He, in 2013, married his longtime partner, Kim Seung-hwan, in downtown Seoul, on Cheonggyecheon, as you all know, a place that mostly heterosexual couples and families use, but he used that particular public space to have a wedding ceremony. It was quite controversial, as you can see in the bottom image. This is sort of the beginning of the fundamentalist Christian protests against the LGBT movement. This is a man holding up a sign in protest of the marriage, and there were actually Christian protesters who literally threw human poop onto the stage to try to disrupt the marriage. So this is quite kind of a public event that got a lot of media attention. And what struck me is in the 2013 media description, it says in Korean, 국내 최초 동성 결혼식. And that struck me as a little bit unusual because in 2013, I was on my sabbatical and I was beginning to look at the mass media from the 60s and 70s, and I found articles like this. This is from 1970. It was published in a weekly publication, a 주간지, and it basically says the exact same thing, 한국 첫 동성 결혼식. So I began to think, this might have been quite common for the media to sort of over and over sensationalize and treat same-sex marriage as if it was the first time that something like this happened. You'll notice that the two images are quite different in the sense that the face of same-sex marriage in recent decades has largely been promoted by men. These two men are both wearing some kind of suit. Gender scholars like to use the word cisgender or gender normative to show that their public presentation is as masculine, versus this earlier image is different in the sense that these are actually two women, and one of them is gender normative or cisgender, wearing hanbok, and her female partner appears here wearing yangbok, Western suit. And the mass media often during the 60s and 70s talked about these people as if they were, like heterosexual bride and groom getting married. That was probably the best way that the public could understand their activities. And in reality, it probably would have been very difficult for women to both wear hanbok or both wear suits and get married sometimes they went to Buddhist temples, sometimes they went to wedding halls. So, this would satisfy the kind of public culture of heterosexual matrimony. At the same time, it was attempting, I think, to dignify their relationship and create some kind of stability for a partnership that didn't have legal recognition. So here are some of the points that I want to try to make with you today, and then I'll show you some of the historical materials I've discovered to come up with some of these conclusions. So definitely 2013 was not the first time for same-sex wedding ceremonies, either by men or women. In fact, there had been some earlier in the early 2000s. And I've already showed you back to 1970, it was claimed was the first same-sex wedding ceremony. That was clearly not the case either. So these two events were definitely not the same. They shouldn't be considered the same thing, but I think there's some relationship to them that I'm trying to explore. And I also want to emphasize that neither of the cases were the first time, even though the mass media used these as a way to sensationalize and to warn readers about the possible dangers of Koreans who were partnering with the same sex. So I've already kind of made this point already. So the legal same-sex marriage of gender non-normative couples like Kim Jo Kwang-soo and Kim Sung-hwan, they actually have tried to demand the legalization of their marriage. That's because Korea has become a democratic society and because same-sex partners could try to make claims on their government to gain protection. Whereas in the earlier decades of when South Korea was under authoritarian rule, same-sex weddings, particularly of female couples, were done unofficially. I think people had a very clear understanding that their marriages would never be recognized by the state. And so they didn't necessarily demand them in official terms, but nonetheless, they were getting married in order to somehow dignify their relationships. I just want to mention that the pairings are often the kind of subcultural words that were used by the women themselves, often not by the press, but as a kind of subcultural term was chimashi and pajishi. So literally Mrs. Pants and Mrs. Skirt. These are the kind of terms that were used for a long time among women who partnered with one another. So there were historical precedents to both cases. And as I mentioned, there is a constant kind of misremembering of the past or a constant forgetting, so that you have to almost relive same-sex intimacies over and over and over again, which has the effect of denying a kind of history to same-sex couples and same-sex intimacy if the media is asking or encouraging readers to forget by presenting each one as a new case. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about the form of the media. So the earlier media in the 60s and the 70s, most of these appeared in very sensational chuganji or weekly publications, which had a lot of sort of journalistic voyeurism. So you have to imagine that people would pick up the weekly magazine, would read this very quickly, and then would throw out the publication before a new one came out the next week. So I want you to kind of think about not only the consumption of the story as the first time, but also the consumption of the magazine and literally disposing of the physical magazine and the physical story itself as part of this process of constantly encouraging people to forget that Korea has this tradition, even as it's being over and over again sensationalized. So despite historical differences between the early 21st century and the 1960s and 70s, something kind of queer, and I use this in quotation marks, something non-normative, something disruptive, something that didn't exactly fit the norms of Korean society was clearly happening before the country's transition from authoritarianism to democracy. So I'm trying to understand what was this something queer that was happening, and I'll try to tell you a little bit about that today. Part of my answer to this question is that what was going on was a certain amount of male anxiety about the disruption of normative kin relations. So heterosexual marriage and reproduction that was necessary to carry on the family line. That was very much disrupted by the Korean War. Many men and women and children lost their lives in the war, and there was a complete disruption and separation of families. And so you have to imagine that at least some of the stories that we read about in the late 50s and 60s had to deal as much with same-sex attraction or gender non-normative behavior as it had to do with survival and economic livelihood when families were disrupted, when family members lost their loved ones to this devastating war. So I understand the media attention that begins after the 1950s as reflecting a certain kind of male-centered anxiety about the nature and status of women either being part of families or being independent from families. Are they going to live their lives as widows? Are they going to partner somehow economically or intimately with other people? Will they remarry? A lot of these issues were being debated at that time, and that's the way I think we should understand the emergence of women who are partnering or having relationships with other women. And then in a later period in the 1960s and 70s, some of these anxieties were also being developed in the context of the sexual revolution. So the global phenomena of women's rights that was taking place in the US and Europe, the men's using of long hair, women's experimentation with new kinds of fashions. We know that under the Pak Jung-hee-Yushin system, that bodily presentation was policed. Long men were not supposed to have long hair. Women were not supposed to have short cuts. There was some fear that hippie culture was coming to Korea, and part of their response was to crack down on gender practices that were seen as being somehow deviant or decadent. or promoting sort of Western style individualism that might disrupt Korea's sort of intensive program towards economic development. So we can also read these anxieties first during the post-Korean War period, and then we can see that in the 60s and the 70s. So the media accounts then tried to accommodate gender non-normative behaviors. They looked, for example, at those images of women who were getting married, and the best way that they could try to make sense of it was to tell readers that, well, these are women just like wives and husbands, they just happen to be two women. So they were often explained as some kind of eccentric practice. And this word isekjok, if you see it, the Korean here often appeared as a kind of marker of something that was familiar, but there was some kind of major difference about the practice. So it could be women who are partnering with each other. Isek or eccentric could also be used to describe women, for example, who are taking up male-dominated professions. So women, for example, who during the 60s and 70s sought economic livelihood by becoming taxi drivers or becoming professional soldiers. Or it could be the opposite, men who were, for one reason or another, taking up positions that were primarily up until that point performed by women. So men who are becoming nurses, for example. We think nothing now of men who are hair designers or fashion designers, but at that time that was a kind of shock to the gender norms that were going on and was some kind of manifestations of deep social transformations that were taking place in Korean society, despite pressures to conform, despite very sort of dominant political policies. There was a kind of eccentric underside that the mass media was discovering, both as a subcultural practice and as a way of selling their media publications. So I find this to be quite interesting because we tend to think of the Park Chung-hee period only as one of repression, but in fact there was a certain level of kind of playfulness, of sensationalism, a kind of perverse part of economic development that we tend not to think about, we tend to overlook, and that's what I'm interested in. So as I've already mentioned, there's a kind of subcultural context in which the stories I'll show you in a minute emerged that had to do with war widows and single mothers after the war, trying to find some way of surviving economically. And we should remember that now it might be possible for some people to take the position of pihon, to not get married, but for a Korean woman in the 60s, 50s, 70s to not be married, to be single, or to raise a child by herself would have been both incredibly difficult financially and would have been quite stigmatized. And so the recourse to finding some kind of partner in order to raise a child or to become a member of a community would have been quite important. So I see same-sex coupling not only about gender and sexuality, but also about trying to economically stabilize and to socially dignify relationships that otherwise had very little status within Korean society. And so I think it's significant that women would, for example, go to Buddhist temples and ask a priest to preside over their marriage, would somehow maybe get the permission of their parents to have this ceremony, would try to invite family members to create some kind of sense of social recognition, even if that wasn't legal. So there was some kind of religious, maybe even familial recognition alongside the support of some non-biological families. And one of the things I want to show you that there are even some cases I've found of family members who, we should remember at this time, again, Korean families had lots of children. This is before the family planning movement. So I'm sure if you're Korean and you look to your grandparents' generation, your grandparents might have had 5 or 6 or 7 children. This was similar in other places of the world. Koreans had a lot of children, and as a poor country, and if there was a poor family, it might have been not possible for the families to raise their own children. So I found cases in which female couples were informally given a child to raise for a heterosexual family who couldn't necessarily take care of the child. So we know during this time there's a huge outflux of babies that are put up for adoption or are taken away from family members and go to places like the United States and Europe. So the overpopulation of babies also finds a place within women who are partnering with each other. So I guess the biggest question I'm trying to think about is what can South Korea's past, the kind of queer past of these alternative or non-normative relationships tell us about how we might today proceed to empower, to give meaning, and for people who are today called same sexual minorities to pursue their own happiness. Here are just a few images I'll show you. Some I often am asked, well, were there any cases of men who tried to marry one another in this kind of unofficial or semi-public way? I've never found any of those. I have found some cases. This is kind of rarely publicized case. This is a gender non-conforming person, born male, but who identified as a woman and who was able to partner with another man. This comes from as early as 1955. But most of the stories that I have found relate to women and often are sort of framed in the context of some kind of either formal criminality or social criminality, or are framed in the context of sexual deviance. So the accounts that we read are often very hard to look at. From today's perspective, they seem extremely homophobic and derogatory. So I just kind of give you a warning. If you sort of read the accounts, you would be quite surprised at some of the language that's used. But what I find interesting is the practice of women partnering with one another appears very early on after the Korean War. This is one of the earliest examples I've found. Again, a kind of sensationalistic understanding of the women's livelihoods and trying to understand them as husband and wife, 신랑 and 신부, and both of them are women. It also tells you that they had some kind of wedding ceremony. Here it says they actually went to a photo studio and had their pictures taken. So here again is another example of how they tried to formalize their relationships. This is another example from pretty close after the end of the Korean War. If you know Hanja, you can see again the kind of almost like biologically stigmatizing language that they're using here. Kihyung, this is often used for some kind of like physical deformity, but here it's talking about like a deformed couple. So this kind of strange or unusual couple. Their sexual practices were often sensationalized mostly for a male reading public. We also have to imagine the position of the male readers and the male authors who were writing about and who were exposing otherwise important phenomena that related. Again, here we can see the reference to war widows who are trying to partner with one another and to survive. So these accounts begin to appear in the mass media. They kind of estimate how many couples there might have been. that most of them were in their 30s. Maybe they were already married during the war and then lost somebody in the war, and that their actions were actually some kind of form of protest. Here, Chohang is written as well. This is also a term that most people are very unfamiliar with, but sometimes appeared in the archive, and this is Mettor Bubu. Mettor, as you know, is millstone couple, a millstone, Mettor. So this is kind of a reference actually to earlier traditions during the Joseon dynasty of court women who were there to pleasure the king, but in their free time might have had some kind of erotic intimacy with one another. So Mettor is kind of this reference to women rubbing their sexual organs against one another. Again, a kind of sensationalized way in which the media is capturing this. These cases appear not just in national media. This is something actually I recently found. The Busan Ilbo now has a digital archive. And if you go back to the early post-war period, the 1960s, you'll often find accounts of similar kind of couples. Again, one appearing in this kind of more masculine form, wearing pants. This would have been the pajishi, the chimashi, and it says they've been living happily together for 10 years. But most of the stories tell us mostly about how female same-sex couples were some kind of threat. And so mostly they appear in the context of some kind of criminal incidents. Often the pictures that appear in the mass media, we have to remember, were probably taken in the context of some kind of police interrogation, because the journalists had very sort of close access to the police. And so this is probably the case of a journalist receiving some kind of phone call or tip-off from the police, comes in, covers the story, or gets an image. This is actually a kind of infringement on the privacy of the individual. So I show you this image very carefully. I probably should have covered their eyes so that I don't infringe on anyone's privacy. You can see the way in which the couples are exposed, and how even though the mass media sort of calls them 동성 부부 or same-sex couples, what's interesting is they always cast this kind of doubt on the possibility that two women could have some kind of long-lasting or meaningful relationship. So I find it's really interesting in a lot of accounts. And I put in red all these kind of question marks. You know, is this the woman? Is this the cha? You know, do they really have a same-sex marriage? So again, a kind of sensationalizing or doubting of this subcultural practice as it's beginning to appear in the mass media. We've already gone over these points, so I think I will kind of skip them. Sometimes the most threatening of them was the pajishi, who, because of their gender nonconformity, were also imagined to be some kind of political subversive threat. You know, you have to remember that South Korea is, of course, defending itself against North Korea. There's a very institutionalized system of registration. This is when, you know, the system of giving numbers based on your sex, 1 and 2, is established. So to have somebody going around who is a woman but is found out under a police investigation to be a man, this is often then linked or associated with the possibility that they are some kind of spy or anti-communist, pro-communist infiltrator or subversive. Some other accounts, particularly about the danger of women who dress up as men. I like to call this female masculinity, because it's quite true that masculinity is not necessarily tied to men. Women can have masculinity, and for many women who are seeking, as I mentioned, economic empowerment, survival, sustenance, associating oneself with masculinity could have something to do with gender performance, but it could also have to do with being able to access jobs and wages, being able to support families. Oftentimes, families who lost all of their sons, it was important for there to be a household head, a kajang. And so if women could refashion themselves along the lines of men, could go out and work as laborers, could earn a living, and maybe could have a female partner, then they could somehow find a place for themselves within Korean society in order to both satisfy their own personal desires and preferences, and maybe also support other women, support their families. So again, the way in which gender and sexuality was closely linked to economic precarity, economic desperation sometimes, and opportunities to try to promote upward mobility. I'm going to skip over this just because I don't think we have enough time. Leanne, Professor Yu, how am I doing on time?
You're fine. You can take as much time as you'd like.
Okay. So I showed you mostly accounts so far from the late 50s and 60s. Most of them come from newspapers. This is a newspaper. The Busan Ilbo account is a newspaper. This was a monthly magazine, or sorry, a weekly publication. But what's unique about the 1960s, particularly the mid 60s to the late 60s, is the period when South Korea becomes increasingly urbanized. You all know probably there's mass migration to cities. People are looking for work in cities. That means there develops a culture of consumerism and leisure for a variety of people. There's, of course, a small middle class, but there's a large working class of population. People who are moving, let's say, from the countryside and trying to get a job in the industrial districts of Yeongdeungpo. Women coming up to the countryside working as shingmo, as housemaids. Many who, without economic resources or education, are going into sex work or prostitution. So there's a huge sort of demand then to provide some kind of recreation or amusement for the many people who are trying to make a living, who are working long days, particularly for men, and who need some kind of rest and relaxation. The 60s is also the golden age of Korean films. So in addition to people going to watch movies, they also are, if they have some education, reading newspapers. And so we should understand this media form. This is the weekly, which becomes extremely popular in the 60s and the 70s and saturates the market. You could read this publication, you could buy a publication and read it. But if you were a man, you could also find this publication if you went to a barber shop or if you went to a train station. You kind of read the magazine and then put it down. This was very quick, sort of recreational reading. It's not like academic reading or really long stories. Usually they're 2 pages. And it was used to kind of entertain people. So maybe I will go back to show you this image. This is an example of how gender non-normative or same-sex practices begin to appear in a variety of forms of media. So these are actually men who were cross-dressing as women and selling their bodies around Itaewon and were captured in a police crackdown and then talked about in the weekly. And just to show you how this was circulating not only in printed versions, but also in films. This is a film, you can watch this on the Korean Film Archive YouTube website. It's a film, a gender comedy film about a man who can't find another job in Seoul and has to become a kind of kiseng, namja kiseng, in order to make it. And all of these kind of images, as you can see, are quite exploitative. They're using the precarity of people who, for whatever reason, are doing gender non-normative labor. And these appear in the mass media as a kind of comedy, as something to kind of laugh about. especially men who become women are laughed at. That's why they appear in these kind of gender comedies. For women who are posing as men, the story is quite different. Or women who are marrying other women is somehow seen as some kind of either threat or some kind of sexual object that needs to be used as a way of providing entertainment. So here you can see an image of the various weeklies that came into being in the mid to late 60s. Almost all of the most important national newspapers, Seoul Shinmun, this is Hanguk Ilbo, Gyeongyang Shinmun, this is Chungang Ilbo, this is also, Chungang Shinmun, this is also Hanguk Ilbo. They all produce these kind of weeklies. You can see mostly aimed at a male audience. You can see this by the females that appear on the covers. These were one of the first publications that had pictures of semi-nude women. So they were kind of quite racy for the time in terms of selling sex as entertainment. And this is where we begin to see these discussions of women who are marrying each other for the first time. So remember I showed you at the beginning the image from 1970 of the first same-sex marriage? This is actually a publication from the same weekly, which only 5 years earlier claimed that this was Korea's first same-sex marriage. And again, presented as some kind of, unusual story, real story and unusual story that kind of mixed journalistic investigation with some kind of fictionalized, exaggerated storytelling. And I think this is why most historians, especially in Korea, don't like to use these materials or refuse to use these materials because they somehow think that they are unreliable or they're inflated or they're exaggerated. And so they can't be trusted. But what I find interesting is the appearance and reappearance of these kinds of women, both, as I tried to mention, as trying to understand it as a subculture of women who are partnering with each other, as well as why media companies repeatedly told these stories and why they appealed to certain kinds of audiences, particularly male audiences, who could sort of look at these couples as both interesting, but also different, sometimes almost pathetic. So I'm kind of interested then in trying to understand the different feelings that might have emerged among readers who looked at these publications. This is some other images from the 1970 wedding. Again, advertised as the first, but clearly was not. This is one of the most rare documents, and I just want to read a little passage from this document, and then maybe I'll try to wrap up. And I find this is really interesting because, as you can already see, these materials were produced through some kind of practices of journalistic exposure. Today, we might call them sort of paparazzi journalism. They often didn't follow any kind of rules for privacy. If crimes were associated with them, they often not only outed the person, but told the readers where the person lived, going all the way down to their sort of address. So highly stigmatized people whose own voices really didn't appear on their own terms. Unfortunately, for this period, we have almost no documents that would give us the voices of the people who are being talked about. So what I find interesting about this document is it actually is a material that I think was told about a member of this 1970 wedding, written by this individual here, a year later in 1971, published in a women's journal. So let me just read a little bit about what I have written about this particular text, and then I'll wrap up. So this was published in a woman's magazine in early 1971 and was a first-person account. And it was quite rare, as I mentioned, for this period because it gave voice to a non-normative or queer person to tell her story in her own words. As the title says, don't ask about our erotic life. The author strategically sought to desexualize and thus normalize, make standard her partnership with another woman. To gain the reader's sympathy and respect, the author wrote an emotionally moving story of class struggle and family sacrifice, positioning herself as a filial daughter of an underdeveloped nation. Given Korea's rigid system of only having male and female, masculine and feminine, so the author initially defined herself as a man, likening her social position to other men who also married women. The only difference between her and other men, she said, was the obvious inability of two women to give birth to a son or a daughter. So not being able to fulfill some kind of patriarchal duties. So having defined her maleness in terms of marrying another woman, she was forced to explain the couple's reproductive challenges based on their female bodies. They couldn't have kids on their own. Although the author did not explicitly mention men and women who couldn't have children, let's say because they were infertile, readers familiar with this common condition might have imagined their own problems of not being able to have children in ways connected to this same-sex couple's own lack of having children. So then the author goes on to explain how she began to live as a social man, presenting herself as a man, but having a biological female body. Her tearful account also forced readers to reconsider how mass-mediated discussions exploited queer people and subjected them to further pain by exposing their stories. Her own story was focused on how class-based poverty and gendered duties led her to cross-dress and engage in male forms of labor for her family's own survival. So in defining her maleness in terms of filial piety, of being a loyal daughter, she was trying to distance herself from the kind of negative images that was being circulated by the mass media. She agonizingly relived a childhood tragedy, highlighting this situation by the early 1950 death of her three young brothers, whom she had to bury herself not far from her hometown in Pohang. So after the death of her brothers, she was aiming to support her family and took the extreme measure of supporting her family by becoming a rough and tumble farmhand, while also assuming other jobs, mostly occupied by women, such as washing laundry, including the laundry of American soldiers who came to occupy the country. So in fact, she was doing both forms of labor, both acting as a filial daughter, helping her family, and as a son working on the farm, a social man, and as a woman gaining labor in this kind of service industries. At 17, she even disobeyed her own parents who wanted her to attend school, and she escaped to Pohang nearby in search of a professional skill. This would have allowed her to have a better wage and to support her family. After making 10,000 won working at a textile factory, another job that was quite common among uneducated women at the time, she attended a 6-month course to become a hair designer, a position that was very popular among women because you could go to school quickly, become a hair designer and earn a better wage than if you were working in a factory or if you had to involve yourself in sex work or some kind of other service industry. She articulated as an economic choice to support her family while her surviving brothers completed their schooling and their military service. She strategically chose to cross-dress as a man to gain a higher salary. So according to her own story of success as a filial daughter or a loyal son, this decision ultimately paid off, allowing her to return home for her father's 60th birthday party, his 환갑 잔치. All of the expenses for which she was able to pay her own by herself, and thus kind of position herself as a successful and filial son, even though she was a woman who was working as a man. So her gradual assimilation into becoming a man, as she described it, finally led her to consider marrying another woman. But only after ensuring the economic survival of her family and promoting the professional success of her older brothers did she begin to pursue her own romantic interests. In describing her sexuality, the author minimized the sort of stigma against women becoming romantically involved with one another, which we've seen the mass media had very sensationally written about in the past. While admitting that as a teenager she had found beautiful women more attractive than handsome men, she explained that her same-sex desires only took root when she learned of female couples who dated one another from her boss at the beauty salon where she worked. And we often hear about 미용실 부부, women who met one another at the beauty salon, which seems to have been one place where women who were either sexually attracted to one another or were romantically, intimately wanted to become involved with women could meet one another. Her familiarity with lesbianism was further developed after watching the 1960 film 질투. This is the first South Korean film to portray female homoeroticism on screen. This is actually the cover image of the book I edited. We don't have the film with us, but this is a still image of two women who are romantically involved. And this seems to have been some kind of inspiration for women who saw the film on screen. And even though couples were sort of described in very negative terms, some scholars have used the word shadow reading to describe how women were able to look at negative images, even in film or in print media, and use those images to imagine their own future. So the fact that she saw two women who were romantically involved with each other on the screen, encouraged her that it might be okay for her to date another woman. So the story goes on then to sort of explain how she met her partner, why she got married, and is a really kind of interesting way, another side of the media accounts that talk about same-sex marriage only from the perspective of male consumers, of mainstream society that sort of expects marriage and calls them wife and husband, that either over-sexualizes their relationships or desexualizes their relationships. This gives us a very intimate portrait about how women came to partner with one another, partly as a result of their own identity, but also as part of their families and of the burdens of becoming a filial daughter, maybe replacing the role of a son in a family that had been lost in the war. So there are some other stories I have in accounts. Quite, as you can see from this image, a quite rich archive, actually, if you're interested in studying the history of female relations. Certainly not the case that there are no gay or lesbian people in Korea. In fact, the popular media was quite fascinated and talked about female couples with a lot of energy. And it's the role, I think, not just of me, but of other people to locate the sources, try to analyze the sources, both for what they tell us about how the mass media tried to respond to the phenomena of female-female intimacies, of men who presented themselves as women, and to try to recount the history of this period in ways that are different from the typical narratives, which tend to focus on either political repression under Park Chung-hee or about labor movements or student movements that protested against Park Chung-hee authoritarianism. There's a whole realm of social and cultural history that we're still trying to figure out. Here I show you kind of as a final image, also how female-female couples were, even without the possibility of being able to quote unquote naturally reproduce children, how somehow they were able to also have a relationship to children and even raise children to create what we might call, today they might be called 대안 가족, alternative families or queer families. And this was part and parcel of Korea's own experience of the war, of economic modernization, of urbanization, the stories that are still kind of waiting for us to explore. Also, again, maybe the last point I'll make is the relationship to religion. Today we hear lots of stories about how fundamentalist Christians are opposed to same-sex rights, to same-sex marriage, or go out on the street to oppose, like Kim Jong-un's marriage. I show you the guy who was throwing poo at the stage. There's also a history, for example, of the Buddhist temple's relationship to these kinds of couples. I think you can see from this image that this is a Buddhist temple. This is the back of a monk's bald head who's presiding over the ceremony. It looks like some male friend or family member is smiling in the background, going to the wedding ceremony. Here you can see a whole group of people. This is from 1985, even a child being brought to the wedding ceremony of two women, one dressed here in a suit, one in a Western style dress. Again, it looks like the inside of a Buddhist temple. There's also a lot to be explored in terms of the relation of non-normative couples to communities, to families, to religious organizations. So hopefully that gave you a little bit to think about, introduces you to my research, and I'm sure you have maybe some questions or comments about that. So happy to answer those questions from you. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Professor Henry. Very, very interesting.